It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to try to reflect on all of the presentations and try to pull it together. And so what I decided to do was to try to just go through the talks and just pick out a few points from each of the talks, and then at the end of each session try to figure out if there were any consensus findings or suggestions that came from the various sections. So we started off with Ann Newman's very, very interesting talk on Thursday night. And Ann talked about successful aging, describing it as a combination of maintaining the highest possible levels of physical and cognitive functioning. And she reflected on that both physical activity and weight gain are major factors influencing functional ability, particularly with respect to mobility disability. And she suggested that there's a real need to translate advances in biology of aging and recent geroscience into therapeutic interventions that work in the older adult population. She spoke a little bit about, for example, stem cell therapy and some of the most recent advances in aging research that I think were somewhat absent from the talks we had in today's program. And I'll come back to that a little bit more at the end. So the first session on Friday was about cells, tissues, and systems. Carl started off by helping us understand that aging is associated with, in many times, the adoption of stereotypic behaviors that show decreases in complexity in response to various environmental tasks and challenges, and that those of us or those people that age successfully somehow preserve the ability to adapt to complex environmental challenges better than those who do not age successfully. Nick followed up explaining to us that variability shouldn't be thought of as noise, and that in many instances chaotic rhythms are healthy. We've learned that from the cardiology literature, but now it's apparent across a wide range of different behaviors, and presented some really, really interesting data demonstrating that dual task performance, which when I was going to grad school, I always associated with a decrement in performance, may actually be may be therapeutic in certain circumstances, and the addition of vibration or chaotic metronomes or other things may actually be associated with assisting people in performing behaviors as they grow older. So Tom talked to us about postural control and how posture isn't just a simple reflex, but it can have significant suprapostural influences on other things that we're doing. And he gave us some fascinating data on people when they go to sea, and that ancient mariners have the ability to respond and modulate postural sway quite successfully in very challenging environments, and that clearly there's a lot to be learned about how people can respond to postural challenges in these kinds of environments, and understanding why older people do quite well on cruises and what we can learn from that. And I think what may be one of the best Skype presentation talks I've ever heard in my life. And I know that Jennifer is without question a good scientist, but she's a hell of a pedagogue too. And I think she took a really, really complex literature and hit exactly the right level for a very eclectic audience like you always have at the Academy. And you know, when you think about the challenging circumstances of just having gone through a death in your family and being able to do that, I'm pretty confident that she'll be sitting amongst us sometime in the future of her career. She talked about complexity from the perspective of neural networks and how when we see visual stimuli or pictures of people, networks of associations are triggered in the brain, and that older adults who age successfully are able to adapt to a decreasing complexity of those networks by adopting strategies that utilize more localized information processing, and that there may be a relationship between physical activity and physical fitness with respect to your ability to preserve that kind of cognitive capacity. And then finally, Russ taught us a number of things, that skeletal muscles work less efficiently as we grow older, and that individuals who are physically active, and particularly people who use maximal strength training, can preserve some degree of muscle efficiency as they grow older. Russ also taught me something, and that was, it's not wise to pick a fight with Juanin's producer. And my advice to people would be, never ever disagree with somebody whose number in the Academy is more than 250 less than yours, because it's a dangerous thing to do. So if you take those 5 talks, what can you draw from them as a group? Well, I think that the first point is that there's some consensus that chaos and complexity can be healthy. That successful aging includes adaptation to both environmental and biological challenges, that older people can perform quite complex tasks, and that physically active and physically fit older adults appear to have a broader range of compensatory strategies available to them than people the same age who are not physically active. So the next session looked at interpersonal factors. Katie Cherry told us a lot of interesting things about the Louisiana Healthy Aging Study, and I think the major points that she suggested was that both social engagement and social support are important factors in preserving self-reported health in the older adult population, and that both physical activity and social support contribute to health and well-being in old age. Larry Brawley talked about the importance of group-mediated cognitive behavioral therapy as an effective intervention for promoting behavioral change, particularly in the area of physical activity. He talked about the need for programs to include self-regulation strategies that include monitoring yourself, goal setting, overcoming barriers, and presenting lapses. And I thought that was interesting relative to the last sessions we've had, where we've talked about activity monitors and devices that provide people with an opportunity for self-monitoring and self-regulation on a regular and daily basis. And I suspect that the popularity of those devices is partly related to the fact that it does enable people to readily obtain feedback and knowledge of results, and people find that to be quite rewarding. Larry also told us to think of successful aging in terms of thriving, or the pursuit of growth and development despite old age. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So Sarah told us theory-based interventions are most effective, and it's important that when we provide opportunities for physical activity, we should be cognizant of the theoretical underpinning of those physical activity opportunities. She spoke to us about her work with the Active for Life study, which is one of the largest and probably most important translational studies that has been conducted in multiple sites using an intervention that is delivered by real-world people in the real world. And the Active for Life study underscores the importance of self-efficacy and increasing self-efficacy as a strategy for promoting physical activity. She suggested to us that we don't know much about differences between strategies for adopting a physically active lifestyle versus strategies for maintaining physical activity, and that additional work is probably needed in order to understand those differences, and that we haven't really addressed that in research to the degree that we might. So from the interpersonal factors, what can we say? Social engagement and social support appear to be critical components of successful aging. Physical activity interventions that utilize behavior change theories are more likely to be successful. There's a need to translate randomized clinical trials into real-world settings, and we need to know more about strategies for adoption and maintenance of physical activity, because they may be different from one another. What about societal factors? Debbie told us that it's important to provide a menu of physical activity choices, and that there are likely to be people who gravitate towards structured exercise programs, and others for whom lifestyle physical activity is important. But regardless, the social, cultural environment for the promotion of physical activity is important. And Debbie started us thinking a little bit about healthy aging technology and the role that it might play in how we approach the promotion of physical activity in the future. Maureen reminded us that access and equity are important issues, and they should not be taken for granted. And there are significant racial, ethnic, and gender differences with respect to opportunities to be physically active. She reminded us also that most older people today, older women today, were young at a time before Title IX and had fewer opportunities to be physically active when they were school children. And we do not know what will happen when people who are young and middle-aged today grow older, and whether there will be a difference between how those older women view physical activity. I think that 20 years from now, we'll be hearing about that here at the Academy, those of us who are still around. Maureen told us about Hillary and the differences between the way that we think of physical activity for older men public figures versus older women public figures. And for me, that was certainly interesting, and I had never thought about that before. And she reminded us that physical activity is associated with issues related to fun, friendship, as well as fitness, and we need to look at all of those social determinants of physical activity. So to summarize the social factors, the socio-cultural environment is clearly important for promoting physical activity. So are access and equity. We haven't spoken much about policy, but Sarah mentioned it a little bit when she talked about the inability of active living every day and active choices to be implemented broadly across the nation. And Title IX is another example of a policy area that clearly has had an impact on physical activity, currently mostly in younger and middle-aged individuals, but will probably have a long-term influence. And then finally, we haven't spoken much about multicultural issues and issues related to diversity, but they're clearly also important. So the final session looked at environmental and behavioral factors. Oops. Wendy gave us some fascinating data from the Women's Health and Aging Study in Australia, and she told me something I had not thought about, and that was that physical activity patterns fluctuate from year to year, and the people who are sedentary versus the people who are active in a cohort are not necessarily. The people who are sedentary and the people who are active are not necessarily the same people from year to year, and we probably need to know more about why people are moving. It's going to go really loud when she turns it on. Why people are moving from sedentary to active and back and forth, and what are some of those parameters. She also talked about the effects of walking and sitting on the trajectory of decline that we find in those three cohorts, and how it's important it is to think through both the positive effects of physical activity as well as the deleterious effects of sitting in trying to project where people will be in old age. And I know that Roberta Rickley and Jesse Jones have done similar work, taking people's functional performance at age 60 and trying to predict what is the likelihood that they will fall below the disability threshold 20 years since. And I think that those kinds of questions are extremely important. And then finally, Katrine told us that walking and steps per day are very important. I think just about everybody in America has figured that out now, because they're all wearing Fitbits or accelerometers. And she told us that for older adults, there's some evidence that we can establish sort of rough guidelines for the number of steps that are coincident with meeting the physical activity guidelines and the number of steps that are associated with sedentary and life and inactivity. It's important to have places to go, to be out and about, and tracking people's life spaces looks like it's a promising area for future research in public health and epidemiology. And to summarize that session, patterns of physical activity fluctuate, so people can be going in and out of active and sedentary lifestyles. We know some of the factors that we talked about. This is the death of a spouse, the empty nester syndrome, and I can't remember what the third one was. Retirement, yeah. Both physical activity and sedentary behaviors are important. Physical activity effects may be greater, or at least some research suggests that. Places to go are important if we want to motivate people to take more steps. And there's a need for increased research into factors that influence walkable communities. So, what about wrapping this all up? I managed to find Barb's high school photo. That is you, isn't it? Right. I wanted to say, Barb, thank you for putting together such an excellent program. Maybe we could give her a round of applause for So are there some kind of big picture things that we agree on? I think we agree that aging results in inevitable and inescapable structural and functional changes that reduce our ability to respond to internal and external challenges. However, I put a question mark behind that because a lot of the geroscience that is going on right now is questioning whether we actually will be able to intervene to some degree in this inevitable and inescapable decline. It's clear that successful aging encompasses a convergence of biology, psychology, social, behavioral, and environmental factors, and that you really need to account for all of those if you're going to adequately describe the universe of successful aging, and that physical activity does help older adults to thrive and grow old better. However, I do believe that there are some additional needs. So we do not currently have a coherent, healthy aging policy framework in this nation and in many countries of the world. So we don't have the public policy and the legislation and the resources needed to implement some of the things that we've been discussing. With respect to geroscience, genetic manipulation, epigenetics, transplantation, stem cell research, we have heard almost nothing about that in this meeting. And I'm sure that 10 or 15 years from now, when the Academy revisits that area, or this topic, we will hear a lot more about the impact of those factors on physical activity, physical fitness, and successful aging. And there's clearly a need to translate findings from randomized clinical trials into nationally and internationally implemented sustainable opportunities for physical activity that are effective, affordable, and fun. And notice I didn't call them interventions, I called them opportunities. I did that for Howie. So it's clear that successful aging involves a life course perspective. So one approach is the one offered by Debbie from the Gauging Aging document. Aging is a normal and cumulative process that extends across the life course. It's part of our biological design, and it is distinct from disease and decline. Another perspective on the life course was offered to us hundreds of years ago by William Shakespeare, and I want to read from As You Like It. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women are merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. His acts being 7 ages. At first the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms. And then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and his shiny morning face, creeping like snail unwillingly to school. And then the lover, sighing like furnace with a woeful ballad made to his mistress's eyebrow. Then a soldier, full of strange oaths and bearded like the pard, jealous in honor, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation even in the cannon's mouth. Then the justice, in fair round belly, with good capon lined, with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances, and so he plays his part. The sixth age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon, with spectacles on nose and pouch on side. His youthful hose, well saved, a world too wide for his shrunk shank, and his manly voice turning again toward childish treble, pipes, and whistles in his sound. Last scene of all that ends this strange, eventful history is second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. So that's a pretty depressing perspective. I'd like to finish with an image. This is Connie Reeves, the lady on the cover of Juanine's book. And I believe Juanine tells me she was teaching horseback riding at 102 years of age. There's a couple of things we can learn from that. First of all, it's possible to thrive in extreme old age. Secondly, sitting isn't all that bad as long as you do it on a horse and you have a cowboy hat. But the third thing I wanted to mention about this particular picture is that not this lady, but one of the authors, Juanine Sperduso, I think is an excellent example to us of what a lifelong commitment to physical and intellectual activity can do for successful aging and thriving. Thank you.